Right. Perfect. All right, here we go. Thanks you both. We'll
Thank you.
chat soon.
Yes.
Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it another minute. I see a lot of people are still joining, so we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, David, do we have you? There he is.
Here. There you go.
Perfect. All right, well, let's get started. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us, everyone. My name is Tiffany O'Neill, and I'm the Executive Director for the Sonoma State University Alumni Association. Thank you for joining us for today's program, The First 100 Days and Beyond, which is presented by the Sonoma State Alumni Association. We're excited to spend the next hour with you as Professor McCuan examines and reviews the first 100 days of the Biden administration and what we might expect in the days and months to come. Today's presentation is being recorded. The recording, as well as a post-event survey, will be emailed to you following today's program. As you think of questions related to the presentation, please go ahead and enter them in the Q&A feature on this webinar. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that come through. And also thank you to those who have already submitted questions. We have them in the queue. Before I introduce today's speaker, I'd like to introduce Logan Pitts, who will be moderating our Q&A at the end of the presentation. Logan currently serves as a senior field representative for State Senator Bill Dodd, covering Sonoma County, and first began working for the state legislature in 2009. He is a proud graduate of Santa Rosa Junior College and Sonoma State University, where he earned degrees in political science, and is also a member of the Sonoma State University Alumni Association Board of Directors. Next, I have the honor of introducing you to our speaker, which I think all or many of you know, David McCuan. David is professor and chair for the Department of Political Science at Sonoma State and is also a proud Sonoma State alumnus, which I don't know that everybody knows that, David. So I always like to put a little shout about that in there. Dr. McCuan joined the faculty of Sonoma State in 2003. His scholarly expertise is in two broad areas: American politics and international relations, and his teaching responsibilities include courses in both international and national politics, international security and terrorism, state and local politics, campaigns and elections, and political behavior. A lot of good stuff there. So I'll go ahead and kick it over to you, Professor McCuan. Thank you again for spending your time with us and our alumni community and friends.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us. It's wonderful to see so many of you virtually here, and I hope we'll have a good time, a fun time talking about this. This has been such an incredible last couple of weeks. The period of time headed up to the 100 days. Since that time, there's so much happening in terms of politics. You'd never really know it was an off year. There are so many things in terms of where the Biden administration goes the next couple of weeks and months. You're going to see the reemergence of Donald Trump here. Certainly the changes in the Republican leadership team in the House next week with Liz Cheney. But you're also going to see a recall election of a governor here in California, which is going to suck up most of the political oxygen as a precursor to what's going to happen in the midterm elections next year. So I'd like to cover all of that as much as possible. Again, as a start, if you want the slides, or if I go too fast, which is always the case, as those of you who have had me in class know, if you want the slides or any of the materials without the cat in the background, that's Ella. If you would like that, just let me know. And you email me and I'll email you a PDF of the slides. I made a PDF, 2 slides to a page, to keep it a little bit smaller for email. So with that kind of lead in, let me share my screen and let's roll here with what we have. Okay, so what we'll do is I'll give you a brief overview of what we're going to do. We'll look back in terms of why the 100 days matters, the Biden start, what that was about. Just to set the stage, the Biden presidency doesn't really begin until February 15th, President's Day, ironically, because the first, say, 28 days, the first 4 weeks are spent undoing the previous 4 years of the Trump administration with a series of executive orders. So ironically, the 100 days starts 30 days, 28 days, 4 weeks into it before they really get rolling. But then we'll look at how that start really is also about maintaining some momentum into later this year, into the midterm elections, and then how all of this matters for what, as I mentioned in the front there, will become the political story of the year, and that will be the California recall, potential recall of Governor Gavin Newsom. Take your comments, questions, concerns along the way. Again, if you'd like the slides, just let me know, and I'll be happy to send them to you. Okay, so to start, just for a second, let's sit back and think about the 100 days mark. The 100 days mark begins really with FDR's presidency, so it's a modern component. Yet, even though the 100 days mark that we saw introduced with FDR and subsequently with his re-elections and with subsequent presidents, the 100-day mark has really changed since Ronald Reagan in 1980, and really in the post-9/11 period with George Bush Jr. since that time as well. So while the 100 days mark is an artificial creation, a creation that was put forward under FDR, perhaps changed dramatically with Reagan in 1981, changing again really after the 9/11 presidency of George Bush Jr., meaning that it has a different presence with Obama in both 2009 and again in 2013, and with Donald Trump when he comes in after the 2016 election. So the 100 days mark has an important element within the history of a brand new administration with Joe Biden. What that means is, as Joe Biden's looking at his presidency, he knows that he has just a short amount of time to do a lot. And in some ways, it's artificial with this 100-day mark. And if you will, much less than 100 days, something that's really more like 70 or 75 days. So when he goes to the joint session of Congress and gives his speech, which was late in the game, if you will, but also at that 100-day mark, it was traditional in a sense of recognizing the 100-day mark, but also untraditional or non-traditional, reflecting this idea of a new 100 days, which is compressed and serious, and in the midst of a country where there is a sizable contingent of Republican identifiers who don't believe that he's a legitimate president of the United States. All right, less than 3 out of 10. It's been around 3 out of 10 for the last couple of months, but now less than 3 out of 10 Republicans believe that the election was legitimate and Joe Biden's inauguration and his election as president of the United States was a legitimate exercise in democracy. This is an important component of what's going on. And that is because what this means is the 100-day mark has this artificial creations become much more important, but in some ways it's never going to cross the Rubicon for a sizable contingent of America. And that has important elements, not only in those deeply red areas, those Republicans who are never going to come over, but also important elements within those outlying areas where Donald Trump did pretty well, which I'll show you near the end here, areas that he held from 2016 that are in some of these suburban areas. Joe Biden does well in some of those areas, but Donald Trump holds a lot of those areas. So this is where areas where some of you have heard me talk about purple people, these people that are somewhat Democratic and somewhat Republican, these true independents. That's going to be hugely important because the calendar is going to rapidly take over here. The other big component here is that we do electioneering bigger and badder than anyone in the world. We are constantly running for office, and that has changed the strategy of governing in marked ways. It means that the permanent campaign that we started talking about in the late 60s has reached a place where it is chronic and deep. This affects not just what is happening at the top of the ticket. This affects not just what Kevin McCarthy is doing in an attempt to be speaker in 2022. It is affecting what goes on at the local level. It is affecting what goes on in California if you're in local government or know someone in local government. And it's that element of joining electioneering and governing that is spilled over and is so hugely important for where our politics are going. So we'll look at that hopefully as well. So first, to kind of sit back first and look at the 100 days of governing, the Biden administration has an approach that is historic. So they are, Joe Biden is known as being moderately radical or a radical moderate, depending how you want to put the modifier there. But what that means is they're aiming high to negotiate down, and they feel that they have such an approach that it is a parallel to really FDR. There are no other parallels. This isn't Reagan in 1981. This isn't Obama in 2009. This is something much bigger and more dramatic than that. In the midst of social and political upheaval that's been going on a lot longer than the tragic killing of George Floyd in our country, but nonetheless, a mark of dramatic social change, a movement and moment that is historic in terms of how the Biden administration sees how they're going to move forward. So they're going to push the Republicans as much as they can. And yet that timing element, the calendar, flips very quickly here because there's summer doldrums of what happens on Capitol Hill, what happens in Congress as states are putting together their budgets, is a reemergence and re-energizing of the Trump institutionalization of the GOP. What we are seeing is a reemergence just beginning the last couple of days in the wake of the 100 days turning of the calendar by the Biden administration, a reemergence of Donald Trump to reinstitutionalize the GOP. That is going to have dramatic effects. So the voting legislation that we saw passed in Georgia, that's now happening in Florida and in Texas and in other states across the country, states that the GOP believes are nominally theirs, a state like Nevada or a state like Arizona, that approach of moving Trumpism down into the state level and holding it in that area with citizens who will be vigilant about what is going on with their Republican legislators and all legislators, that part and that approach is going to grow. And that's going to build in more momentum for Donald Trump headed into 2022. This is a new conservatism, a conservatism that is leaving Reagan behind, if you will, and making the GOP wholly about Donald Trump and that brand. So you'll start to see changes in how the Senate does business. That filibuster debate is going to become much more important. And the rallies that were characteristic of his approach to governing and campaigning, those will return here in short order, perhaps even in the next couple of weeks. So the Biden approach in the first 100 days looks something like this. It looked like a place where you would talk about the impeachment trial and do Senate confirmations. You would undo what had happened in the previous 4 years. That takes up again the first 4 weeks or so. Then you move to address the coronavirus pandemic, while at the same time reversing those Trump administration policies of what you can do, not only with executive orders, but also moving forward on legislation, which leads to the fourth priority of advancing legislative priorities, like, for example, H.R. 1, like dealing with climate change and infrastructure, like funding the next wave of the internet, and linking that not only with the infrastructure package, but linking that with social justice issues, like, for example, removing lead pipes, like building rural internet capacity. All of these things, a huge component of the first 100 days approach. And really the big zinger here, the difficult lift here, is not just the infrastructure package, but really immigration reform and what immigration reform will look like. Because this was the first crisis that we've seen operate in terms of what was happening at the border with the administration. And the administration has quickly tried to move that off the front pages as fast as they can because of the difficult notions around immigration, what that does to the progressive Democratic base, what immigration does for on Capitol Hill. And so immigration reform is going to be a key battleground and test of this administration moving to the next 100 days, or really over the next 1,360 days. From the 100-day mark, there are about 1,400 days left in a president's term. And so that 1,360 days, really less than that now, is what the Biden administration is keeping a keen eye on. There's some roadblocks over these next 1,360 days. Obviously, what's going on with the filibuster and requiring those 60 votes to advance legislation, or whether you're going to limit legislation under a simple majority vote via what's called the reconciliation route. This is much more likely to happen. This removes someone like Joe Manchin from a central role for Democrats, but it doesn't remove Joe Manchin and others. So even if, for example, Senator Feinstein moves some way, or another Democrat is upset about how things are going, Democrats have to stay whole. And if they are unable to stay whole, they really can't lose more than a handful of folks, because rapidly what will happen is their inability to even move forward on things like reconciliation. There are also intra-party divisions. I'm going to show you a couple of graphics here to show you how close things are, just to pan out and remember. I've given you a lot so far. Just remember that the Democrats' majority in the House right now allows them to only lose 2 to 3 seats, or 2 to 3 votes. That's all. That's all Speaker Pelosi can afford. That is the closest margin that House Democrats have had since 1893. So the division that is pressing on past 100 days, or the next 1,300 days or so, is very difficult for Democrats in a way forward, with that looming recall here in California in the fall and the midterm elections next year. That says nothing about what happens in the courts, or what potential court challenges exist, or whether you want to advance something beyond a commission to put more people on the Supreme Court. All of this means that the courts, the intra-party divisions, and the rules of the Senate in particular are going to be hugely important over these next couple of weeks and months in the near term, and then longer. But one thing that has happened is that the Biden administration has been historic in the types of people that it's appointing to federal agencies, in the cabinet, and at the sub-cabinet level. Almost 60% of its appointees through 29 April were women. 1 in 5 are African American. You see the numbers there for Hispanics, Latinos, Asian Americans, Middle Eastern, and those that are veterans, or those that are identified as having other challenges. Notice that almost 1 in 3 are naturalized citizens or the children of immigrants. This level of diversity is historic at this point in a presidency, and also marks, if you will, the approach that the Biden team has to not only go big and go far, but at the same time change how the cabinet looks, and the undersecretaries and assistant secretaries, and those that are in the government itself. This is a very dramatic set of movements. We would expect to continue to see this as the Biden administration moves forward. And so far, they have had not really that much trouble in terms of increasing both the level of diversity and getting their appointments through, with only 1 or 2 exceptions. Whoops, I'm sorry about that. The other component to this is to show you, this is a picture of how close Congress is today. As you can see, that losing of 2 or 3 votes that Speaker Pelosi has puts Republicans, and the minority has really no power in Congress really whatsoever, but it puts Congress all of a sudden in the hands of a surly set of folks that can be on the right, that are interested in being ascendant with Trumpism and ascendant with Kevin McCarthy. If, for example, you lose 4 to 6 votes or are unable to corral some type of coalition together. So far, Speaker Pelosi and her team have been able to do an excellent job with this. They've been able to keep Democrats whole. So far, Chuck Schumer in the Senate has largely been able to do the same. They've used the vice president on 3 key votes. Those votes have been more procedural to advance important elements of the Biden administration. You would expect that from the vice president, but it's not been, if you will, hugely expansive or too costly yet. But because of the closeness of this coalition moving forward, it will challenge things like the infrastructure policy and or any type of controversial appointments or moves on things like, for example, immigration reform. I'm sorry about this. The other part of this is to pay attention to the barometer of presidential approval. Joe Biden's approval right now sits around 57 to 59%. It's ticked up since Gallup did this on the weekly average to about 59%. So he got a small bump in the wake of his speech to the joint session of Congress. But that number at 57 looks interesting at some levels. Notice that the 40%, basically the 60-40 split with very few having no opinion. It is both interesting that this number is approaching 60% and at the same time interesting that no one has no opinion. Just as this is similar to what we've seen in the Trump era in terms of everyone having opinion about Donald Trump, negatively, favorably, whatever it is. And similarly with Joe Biden, that kind of momentum of no opinion has carried over. The Biden first 100 days in historic perspective looks like this. As you can see, he's doing better than Donald Trump, and he's doing not as well as what we saw with G.W. Bush or with Obama, but in that line with what we saw with Bill Clinton or even the elder Bush in 1989. Not hitting those places of Ronald Reagan really, or Obama for the modern era. You could talk about Kennedy and Eisenhower. It's a completely different type of presidency between then and now, but nonetheless, he's in the wheelhouse of some place. That's pretty good in the first 100 days. Let's see if we can do this one. Okay. Approval by subgroups, you would expect this as well. Democrats obviously think he's doing a great job. Republicans could care less. And I want to especially point to what is happening in terms of the gender gap, because the gender gap is something we want to focus on, particularly for the midterm elections. Notice that women have a much higher approval of Uncle Joe, President Biden, than men do. And in addition, we see some differences between white and non-white adults and between those who have attended college and those who have not. But when we look at this and start to delve into some elements, one thing that is dogging Joe Biden is the specter of Donald Trump. And the specter of Donald Trump locking in not only his supporters, but some others as well, is a component to Biden's approval and a component to what is happening and motivating members of Congress as well. For example, if we look just back to what was happening in March and we compare them head to head, Donald Trump's approval is lower than Joe Biden's. Okay, we would expect that. But look at that disapproval number. So what has happened is the approval disapproval number of Joe Biden hits some level of an upward component. It moves up, but it has a ceiling, and that ceiling is a function of what Donald Trump is doing. We haven't seen a lot of Donald Trump right now. We've heard from him occasionally. We had the recent elements of what was going on in terms of Facebook, but really what you have going on here is Joe Biden's approval ceiling is a function of Donald Trump's appearance, which is exactly how Donald Trump would want it. So that's what also an element of what is going on in the background or lurking for this administration. Democrats and Republicans, this is just show you that I'm not making stuff up. Democrats think that Joe Biden is the legitimate president of the United States. But as you can see, we've gone from about 1 in 3 Republicans that thought that was the case to about 1 in 4 Republicans. And it's this very notion, not debating immigration reform, not debating infrastructure, not debating COVID or what to do with China or with our foreign policy, what to do about hard questions around race and police. Those are questions we would expect to see differences. What we are doing now is debating the very nature of democracy itself. And that is really problematic because that's a divide in a place that's going to hold down the president's approval regardless of party and create and foster this continuing divisiveness and hyperpolarization, hyperpartisanship that we see. All right. Okay, I apologize for this jumping around. Let me show you what's going on in the background as well. The background noise for all of this is obviously the potential recall of Gavin Newsom. There's the petition for the recall and what goes on, some screen grabs of what is happening with people signing the petition. But this particular recall, this background noise, has an important element to driving what's happening in our politics. If part of the argument about what is happening with Joe Biden is that periodically Donald Trump pops up and down and around and is all over the country, that means that one element and one key thing going on with the California recall is that the White House, particularly the Vice President of the United States, and the White House proper is going to have to play, as well as all national Democrats, in terms of protecting Governor Gavin Newsom. And that opens up the question of whether Donald Trump can stay out of the race. He's not hugely popular in California, but the presence, his ability to raise money, his ability to get with Kevin McCarthy and to embrace dollar raising and momentum headed beyond the recall into the 2022 midterms is a huge element of reemerging and using California as a template for what can happen in the midterm elections of 2022. So this recall, it becomes much louder, noisier, and much more important to what's happening even in the Biden administration and on Capitol Hill in terms of what happens with Nancy Pelosi and with Democrats while we're, for example, redrawing lines. One element of the redrawing of lines is what is happening, with the recent census data and the apportionment of congressional districts in 2020. As you can see, Texas gains a seat, California loses a seat. States that Democrats have done pretty well in the recent past, in terms of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio is the most northern southern state, so not as much there, but certainly Illinois, and again, other states in the West, like for example, Colorado and Oregon. There's some changes that are going on. Many of you know this, you've studied this, you've heard about this, that is changes in the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt, and the fleeing of, if you will, blue collar workers who have been traditionally Democrats until the last couple of cycles. That element may help Democrats long term, but it helps Republicans in the near term. And it's how it helps Republicans in the near term down ballot that's important. So when you're talking about voting rights in Georgia or Florida or Texas, these states that are, if you will, where the real battlegrounds are, and if those states are gaining population and gaining traction in Congress, it means they're also gaining traction at state legislative levels. They can control legislation, they can control redistricting in those areas, and that gives Republicans a leg up in terms of state legislative seats. And if they're aligning with Trump, they get that even more so. Longer term, as those populations become more diverse, obviously, that is more important for Democrats, but Republicans won't sit by the sidelines as they're drawing these district lines out of this census and this allocation of this apportionment of seats out of the 2020 census. Sorry. All right, here is, what has been, I apologize. Here's what's been happening over the last 20 years. If you look at what's happened more broadly over the last 20 years, you can see that California's gained seats, gained in population, Texas has, and Florida has. But essentially, that fleeing of the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt and to the coast, particularly the West Coast, has continued in the Southeast. This is the net change in population tracked by Larry Sabato and his group at the Center for Politics at University of Virginia. And as they've looked at this, what they have seen has been a much more dramatic, bigger change and a shift that has been happening. This is important in the near term, again, as I just talked about in terms of district lines, but there's something else kind of going on here beyond that. And what's going on here beyond that is the shift in partisan alignment, the types of Republicans and the types of Democrats that are being elected. This may help Democrats in a state like Georgia, but it could hurt Democrats in a state like Colorado. It could help Republicans in a state to hold a state like, for example, Michigan, or to play in a place like Wisconsin, but longer term would hurt them in a place like Texas and Arizona. All right, so announced this morning were total non-farm payrolls and the employment report, which expected that there would be an announcement that the economy would grow by somewhere between 900,000 to 1 million jobs. And that didn't happen. Non-farm payrolls about 144, overall number was about 222,000. So this report this morning has created some worries because of what's known as the trifecta of doom. Presidential approval, that 57 to 59% number that Joe Biden has, the move to pass immigration reform, the move to pass a huge infrastructure proposal that really moves farther than anything we've seen in the past and starts to link things like, for example, high-speed internet in rural areas, as I mentioned before, and getting all of the lead pipes out of all of the water delivery systems in the United States. Things like that are going to be a function of expectations for the availability of capital. And what we have seen is somewhat of a slowdown, and that's because the most recent job reports in terms of the economy have affected, that we saw that were, say, positive the last couple of months, those have affected the lowest wage workers, some elements of reopening, if you will. There seems to be some miss with middle to high wage workers for what's been happening moving forward, and that could be a problem for the Biden administration over the next 100 days. This next report would come out, it comes out based on numbers through the end of June. This would come out in July, in the July period, just after the July 4th holiday. So pay very close attention to two things that come out in July. One is presidential approval and whether he's still in the 50s. Is he around, say, 55%, maybe a little bit less than 57? Is he at 60%? And then that jobs number that will come out. There will be subsequent monthly numbers before that, but these job numbers that are come out quarterly and head into the summer, together with that June 30, July 4th presidential approval number, give us some idea a year and a half before a midterm election how presidents will do. So this next election matters dramatically. These are the seats that are up in the 2022 US Senate elections. As you can see, there are a number of red states and blue states, but Republicans are more exposed, just like they were in 2020, than Democrats are. So the Democratic seats are, quote unquote, safer than what we have for the Republican seats. But typically in a midterm election, a president loses seats. This is the midterm election performance of a president over some period of time. There's the Tea Party revolt there with 63 seat losses with Barack Obama in 2010. There's 54 in 1946, as you can see. But midterm presidential loss is a function of presidential approval, disapproval, that number of approval, disapproval, job growth, and some factor of the economy. Those numbers are hugely important for what comes next because it predicts, if you will, gain or loss of those Democrats that are allied, presumably with Joe Biden, versus those Republicans that would be allied, for example, with the former president of the United States, Donald Trump. So it's a huge barometer of what happens. This is the slide that matters most, if you will, because gain and loss, one of the biggest rules in American politics is that since the Civil War, the in-party, the president's party, loses seats in a midterm. There are only a few exceptions to this. One of those exceptions is 1998 during the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Another example of an exception is 2002 with the first national election after 9/11, if you will. But one of the most rock solid rules in American electoral history and American elections is that the president's seat, the president's party, and the seats in the House go down in a midterm election. So that would portend that that close margin that we see, for example, now with Democrats in the House would go away. Part of this is a function of that gender gap. So if women are more likely to support Democratic candidates or President Biden in this particular case, the gender gap in terms of House popular vote also could be helpful in buoying things up. So those issues that are more important in terms of polling for women that we see, issues around work, equal pay, around paid family leave, around healthcare, these types of things, the Biden administration needs to show progress on those particular issues because they go right into the wheelhouse of their voters. For Republicans and for Donald Trump, for Kevin McCarthy, for Mitch McConnell, what they're going to do is try, obviously, to close that gender gap and to rally out some of their voters in some of those key districts that we see because of the importance of this gender gap in the House vote. So the pattern of midterm loss is quite substantial. It's quite dramatic. And really, 98 and 2002 are outliers. We see an average loss of about 35 seats in the first midterm and 38 seats in a second midterm. So the average has gone up since 2000. If you want to think of it that way, it has increased. And that's because the president's ability to deliver what political scientists call coattails, or the coattail effect, to bring people with him in terms of the party, that has gone down. All right. I'll wrap up here in just a few minutes so we can get to some of your questions, but I want to add a couple of more slides. One of the reasons you have to pay attention to Donald Trump in the midst of the Biden presidency is because of what's happened down ballot or at the state level. Republicans lost 187 net legislative seats under the Trump presidency. Democrats, 2 terms with Barack Obama, lost 938 seats. 938 seats. This is at the state legislative level. Most of those seats that were lost under the Obama presidency were lost in 2010, the Tea Party election, but Democrats did suffer losses in the 2014 midterm elections as well. Republicans didn't suffer as deeply under Donald Trump's presidency down ballot. All right. The Democrats did pick up. They did flip, as you can see in the bottom in bold. They did flip 6 legislative chambers in 5 states, Colorado, Maine, New York, Virginia being the most notable ones, where Democrats also picked up a trifecta. They owned all of the government, if you want to think of it that way, the state legislative and the governorships, like we see here, for example, in California. But down ballot, the effects of Trumpism seem to be positive, net positive for the Republican Party. That affects the redistricting and reapportionment numbers as well that we're seeing. Now, in the 2020 election, there are these things called pivot counties. These are counties that voted for Barack Obama in 8, 12, and then Donald Trump. So they voted Obama, Obama, Trump. The red counties that you see here are pivot counties that voted Obama, Obama, Trump, Trump. They voted Obama twice and then Trump twice. They're in red. The blue counties voted Obama, Obama, Trump, Biden. So these few number of blue counties voted and flipped from Donald Trump to Joe Biden to Democrats in the 2020 election. And there's some interesting things here, okay? Donald Trump won 174 of those Obama, Obama, Trump, Trump counties, all right? Biden won 20. His average margin of victory, as you can see, was quite close. Trump held and grew those counties at that time. So that means that the closeness of what we saw in the 2020 presidential election and how that reverberates or pulls or rolls over to 2022 will be an important element. But incumbents won at high rates. So as we start to look down ballot, incumbents won at huge numbers. Incumbents always win at pretty high rates, generally 90 to 95%. And the 2020 elections for incumbents that were down ballot, the same thing was happening as well. But look at this particular thing that's happening in California. The types of Democrats that are winning in California is going up, and who those Democrats are is also increasing. Democratic office holders at the city level in California are not just bluer or more Democratic. They are much more liberal and much more activist oriented, much more Democratic in all levels. As you can see, that what has happened over, say, the last 10 years is that Democratic city officials have become basically 1 out of 2. Even though these offices are nonpartisan, the NPP number has slowly crept up, but the Republican number has plummeted in California. Who are these individuals? Well, there are still quite a few that are men, but the number of men is coming down and the number of women is increasing, about a 60-40 split, 60 male, 40 female. That's an important element of what's happening here, and who they are. The top number, the red line, are Latino local officials. And then Asia Pacific Islander is the green line, the purple blue line at the bottom is African Americans in terms of office holders. So we have more Democratic office holders. We have a different type of Democrat. and who they are and what they look like is changing dramatically as well. So while we have Trumpism going on in the nation in many areas and a Democratic ascension here locally in California, and the Biden administration trying to navigate through this, this is a difficult set of circumstances for any president to be successful. Here's what's happening in California more broadly. Over time, this is to show you how much more democratic California has become in terms of local officials and what is happening, even in areas that we consider to be, say, inland or more Trump oriented, but there's a bifurcation that's going on. This bifurcation has dramatic policy effects for the Biden administration as it plays in California, because California has not been this important in a presidential administration since arguably really the Reagan era, when Reagan came in. And it's that element that also is going to be important to what is happening in terms of the recall. So the good news, as I wrap up here, is that California politics is fun. The 2003 recall, where 135 people were on the ballot, was an amazing event. Because of social media, because it costs only $4,000 to get on the ballot, or 7,000 signatures. If you get to 7,000 signatures, you get the $4,000 back. That means the potential to have 300 to 500 people on the ballot running in this recall is great. You could see a whole bunch of people beyond just Caitlyn Jenner, who were B and C list celebrities, to join this race. But there's a tremendous amount of spillover or unintended consequences as a result of this. And you're starting to see elements of this now. You may have seen or heard about the Hannity interview with Caitlyn Jenner from her plane hangar. And today, the race in terms of negativity and what's happening was released and talking about the governor and in terms of what he's been doing in COVID relief with big tech. So these types of elements related to the appearance at the French Laundry or related to Trumpism and his popularity is going to lead to a divisive negative recall, a wild, wild west of a recall. And that could upset the best laid plans, even of the Biden administration as well. So with all of that, let me stop there, take your questions. I gave you a lot, apologize for those slides coming through, but I'm happy to take your questions. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Professor McCuan. Wow.
That was a lot.
So much going on. We got a historic new administration. We got these razor thin majorities. We got these changing demographics. It's really interesting to see it all together. So we'll start on the recall, just because that was what you ended with, while it's fresh. So yeah, you have Caitlyn Jenner in her private airplane hangar. You got the last guy who ran with his pet bear. You got the two serious Republicans, former congressman and former mayor of San Diego, getting less attention objectively. Is that dynamic just that sort of circus kind of atmosphere? Is that just a feature of California recalls? Or is that also maybe a reflection on the Republican Party? And then my most important question, can you get me a reservation this weekend at the French Laundry?
Yeah, I think some of those reservations will open up. But you're also going to see, now that I think John Cox has been there with the bear, I think you're probably going to see more people going there for the Republican Party than we've ever seen. All right, so recall politics are a wild animal. We have so far, obviously, John Cox. Remember, everyone, that John Cox ran against Gavin Newsom in 2018, and he lost 62 to 38. He lost by the highest margin that any person has lost in California gubernatorial history. So Gavin Newsom didn't just beat him, he hammered him. But Cox is kind of the Republican establishment guy. Part of that, as you mentioned Kevin Falconer, who's trying to go this moderate middle of the road, has some difficulty losing his message. The Republican Party, the California Republican Party, was taken over by Trump staffers from Washington, D.C. on March 1st. And that means that Trump's influence within the California Republican Party, not to win the recall, but to increase Republican Party registration by 1/3. It is about 25% now. No party preference registration is 24%. But if you could raise Republican Party registration by 1/3 to say 33%, 1 in 3 Californians, that would be a major victory for the Republican Party. So the goal is not necessarily to win, setting aside what Tom Del Beccaro and others say. The goal is to raise the Republican relevance in the state relative to 2022 and potentially other places to play in the state, in the congressional, in the California congressional delegation. However, I would also watch the private or secret or under the radar influence of somebody like Rick Grenell, the openly gay former ambassador of the United States to Germany and director of national intelligence. Rick Grenell is a Trumper. He's very close to President Trump, and he is a possibility as a candidate. However, on top of that, the celebrity factor has to matter. So my favorite candidate would be Ayesha Curry, because she would not only enter the race and win, she would upset the best laid plans. But so far, if I were to make a prediction too, I'd say that Governor Newsom is able to wade through this.
Okay. Interesting, yeah, that we haven't seen anyone on his left yet. So we'll stay tuned for that and see if anyone takes a shot.
There were 5 Green Party candidates that ran in 2003, just as of the 135. So that's a big deal.
We'll get some, definitely. So let's move back to the national stuff. So like you said, part of the reason they care about this recall is to keep some of those House seats that Republicans won in 2020. They want to make sure they hold on to that. So a question I want to ask you about the House and kind of what's going on there. So like you said, 26% of Republicans consider Joe Biden's election legitimate,
right,
according to polling. And one of those is Liz Cheney, who's the number 3 Republican in the House of Representatives. She just got reelected 3 months ago to that job, and it looks like she's about to get fired from it by her colleagues because she won't agree with Trump's version of reality.
Yeah.
Can you talk about kind of what's happening there? Is that just a typical thing you see when a party is out of power? You see those fights in leadership, or is this a bigger battle within the Republican Party?
Yeah. So as the Biden administration is navigating through what to do on Capitol Hill, the Republican Party is changing so rapidly with each term. I mean, from what Paul Ryan experienced as Speaker, from what John Boehner experienced with Speaker, all the way forward for all Republican leaders. And that means someone like Kevin McCarthy is dealing with a moving target. Liz Cheney's presence, and it's unusual because Liz Cheney would have been characterized as a right-wing Republican by any stretch of the imagination.
There is no right to Liz Cheney.
Yeah. There's just no difference there. But because of the influence of Trumpism and adherence to Trumpism, Representative Stepanek from New York is the heir apparent. And so Liz Cheney should lose that vote next week as the number 3. She will go out, but she'll be able to use this as some way to raise some level of money. But she will be out at a place where it also puts her on the chopping block. It puts her on a place to lose in 2022 to show you just exactly what the shift forward is. As that identity crisis goes on with Trumpism, and the thing to say is that Trump wants Stepanek to replace her, but not everybody in the Republican caucus likes Stepanek because they don't think she's a team player. They think she hasn't held true to Trumpism. She's taken advantage of the situation. But as that works out, let's say Stepanek replaces Cheney, Kevin McCarthy is elected Speaker. That means that Donald Trump is renewed as a national figure, and the caucus that will be run by Kevin McCarthy is going to be incredibly raucous and unruly. It will not be one Freedom Caucus, it'll be 6 Freedom Caucuses, and that'll be hell to deal with if you're the Biden administration, which means very little gets done after potentially the 2022 midterms if they were to lose.
Okay, yeah. So we'll go to some audience questions. We've gotten some in, and we'll go to one that we got ahead of time. Someone asked about comparing Biden to FDR, and you touched on that. But let's go into the policy a little bit. This person's asking, we have a lot of infrastructure that needs to get fixed up in our country. It's been rated poorly by many objective analyses. Are we going to see, a conservation corps type program? What do you see President Biden trying to build to fix that problem?
Yeah, so the way they're going to cut this infrastructure deal is they're going to bifurcate what's happening. They're going to have parallel tracks. They'll have something that moves the Republicans on core infrastructure, the bridges, the buildings, the highways, these types of things that you might think of as old infrastructure. The Republicans put forward a number that was about $500 billion. That number will be somewhere in the range of 750 to 838. That's the top figure for the administration for core infrastructure. It'll be between, say, 750 to 800 billion dollars. Then they will take the second part, that part which is, for example, related to high-speed internet, to the water pipe replacement, to issues around social justice for access to clean water, for example, and green jobs. That second part which is much more substantial and probably at least $1 trillion, 1 to 1.1 trillion. That will be where the battle will occur. That part could be carved out further to bring some of it into and attach it to other deals, like a broader deal, not adhering to things like immigration reform, to other elements. Well, does that mean a conservation corps type presence? No, but what it does mean is that there's going to be a building boom because Joe Biden wants to see and have jobs that can move forward. That is the plan they can lay forth to voters in the midterm elections. That push of bifurcation is something they're willing to negotiate, even though they put forward a plan that was quite substantial. If you add up what they have done on top of the $5 trillion that that Congress has already passed for COVID relief, you're talking about a plan that's about 10 or 11 trillion dollars, whereas the whole U.S. national debt is about 28 to 30 trillion dollars. So you're talking about something that moves the debt up to, all said and done, to deal with COVID. That's about 35% of the national debt just to deal with COVID. That historic circumstance is how Joe Biden sees himself in an FDR-like way.
Yeah, interesting. Definitely not the 1996 speech from Bill Clinton of the era of big government is over.
Right, or 2009 by not going big enough with Barack Obama. I think both of those parallels are spot on there.
Yeah. So we have a special guest with us today, Santa Rosa Mayor Chris Rogers, and we'll ask one of Chris's questions, talking about those challenges that Joe Biden has to get reelected. So Chris asked, you mentioned California is more important now than it has been since Reagan, yet it's slanted further left and progressive. How does Biden navigate keeping California happy without losing Pennsylvania and other swing states? How does he do that balance?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things you can do. One is he can spend a lot of time in Pennsylvania, a state that is rapidly changing and it has some redistricting issues that are going to be made more difficult because of what we just saw with the census count, for example, in Pennsylvania. In terms of California, obviously, this is where the vice president comes in. This is where her role goes up in a big, big way. And if you spend time in California securing Gavin Newsom against the recall, you re-elect Gavin Newsom a year before he has to run for re-election. So while the stakes are high, the opportunities are great because that gives you some momentum to then, if you will, move out the vice president to places like Georgia, to move her out to places like the suburbs of Philadelphia, where she polls very well and does huge with suburban women. So there are some opportunities there. But can you cut deals, which Joe Biden is willing to do? And I'm going to move Chris's question a little bit farther. While Joe Biden was on Capitol Hill for 40 years, over 200 members of Congress never worked with him and have no relationship. So the idea that Joe Biden will cut a deal, and he will if he can, the idea that he'll actually be able to pull that off, that's really an open question. So their ability, nonetheless, to play in California is going to be front and center. But it'll also be a foil for Republicans and for Donald Trump as well.
Yeah, a lot of Joe Biden's friends from the Senate are no longer on this planet. So let's get a question from another friend of mine, Mark Stapp, talking about that division we kind of talked about with the election legitimacy. An interesting question. How should we distinguish between GOP supporters who tell pollsters they think Biden's election is illegitimate, and looking back to 2016, Democrats who kind of embraced the resist label, push for impeachment right away? Is this just part of our current era of politics?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So look, if you think about where things are at in terms of how Democrats, because they were shocked at what happened in 2016 and the rise of Trumpism, and now this bifurcation that led to, first a violent uprising against the government in January 6th. That's a big difference, first and foremost. And Mark, I'm going to take your question even farther. What's punctuated much of this has been the difficult discussion around race. And because the demographics are changing so rapidly, and because each party is facing a reckoning with how to do this based upon its core constituencies, this is something that the parties can not navigate very well, but some leaders, like a president and a vice president, can navigate. So I think this is a place where there's actually an opportunity for somebody like the president or the vice president to invite in Tim Scott and to bring in Karen Bass and to cut a deal now about police reform and what that looks like so that the George Floyd Act can become a reality. There's an opportunity here that Joe Biden senses that the Obama team didn't take advantage of. Partly that's because there was internal rumblings in the Obama team between the Clintonites who had come over and run the government last for Democrats and the Obama people who wanted to move forward. And that battle is not something Joe Biden faces. So I would say, Mark, there is an opportunity for Joe Biden to lead. And the way you do that is you bring Tim Scott and Karen Bass into the same room at the White House and you get that deal done.
You get stuff done. Yep. So someone's asking a question about the Senate map. Go back 6 years to 2016. Why does that election make 2022 favorable for the Democrats next year?
Yeah, so the types of seats that are up in 2022 for Democrats in that terms of that class. One is it's not a presidential year. 2016 was a presidential year, so you get a bump up. 2016 really was the last election where the old party coalitions struggling with each other, establishment Democrats, establishment Republicans. Okay, one goes with Secretary Clinton, one goes with the insurgent candidate, Donald Trump. That election was the last election like that. We're in like a flux period where the parties are changing rapidly, where Democrats have to decide what they're going to do with labor and how they treat labor voters when they're declining as a portion of the workforce, where Republicans are going to have to decide what they're going to do in a changing America and what that looks like, not now, but what that looks like in 24 and 28, because that'll be a key component. In 2022, there are seats that will be hugely fought over, like the Georgia seat again, like a Florida seat, like some of these battleground seats that we saw in the midst of this changing America in a non-presidential year. And so Democrats are raising a lot more money than they have before, which they typically only brought this level of fundraising, not in off years, but in on years like presidential election years. So they'll have the resources that they didn't have before in a non-midterm election year.
But one thing that he won't have, someone points out, he's not going to have a big swing in Congress. You're going to have this divided. You're not going to see what happened with FDR or Lincoln or even Reagan to a lesser extent, where they had this momentum. How does he get things done in our current context? Like, yeah, how do we cut those deals?
Yeah, and I'm going to even be more precise. How do you cut deals with the other side that sees everything that you do as socialist, or everything you see as central? I think they're using the term centralized socialism now. So how do you soothe your progressive base, which is restless and wants to tackle some of these issues and sees most of these issues through the lens of social justice, and at the same time bring a few Republicans along? There doesn't seem to be much writing on the wall that this administration can pull that off. However, because Biden sees himself in historic circumstances, not as a historic guy, a historic leader or president, he sees himself at a moment in time in which he can alter the direction of America. They dream big, they go big, but they will negotiate down, and they're willing to do that. That adeptness or adroitness to pivot is something we haven't seen since, for example, Clinton started to do this with triangulation. And this is something Joe Biden admired about Clinton by using triangulation and doing that. That's what happened to Bill Clinton after 1994 when Newt and the Republicans took over. And the Biden administration has that plan available to them. They just won't do that yet because they don't want to tick off progressives and lose that part headed into past 2022 into the 2024 period.
Yeah.
Good
so we got 4 minutes left. I'm going to try to bundle a few questions. Okay. And this is an interesting question from Manny Rodriguez. Should Democrats have a backup candidate? You know, should they have someone in the recall? And I'll kind of bundle, someone's asking about the jobs report. So if we keep seeing these bad numbers, these bad overall fundamentals, what do you think? Would you tell the Democratic Party you got to have a backup, or no? Is it all Gavin?
Yeah, so there is a debate. People that run campaigns that don't like people like me say
everyone
no.
likes you, David.
No, I meant political scientists. The political consultants and the professionals say no backup. People who've been in politics for some time, like Willie Brown, say it would be wrong to not have a backup. I would say it's political malpractice not to have a backup, because here's why. Nobody saw that Arnold Schwarzenegger was going to get in. There isn't an Arnold Schwarzenegger on the horizon. But A celebrity who does enter the race upsets the race. That's not Caitlyn Jenner. All right. That's Will Smith Jr. That's Oprah. That's somebody like that who upsets the race. That's Elon Musk, who has more money than God. And if someone like that enters the race and you don't have a backup, then there are issues. So far, I will say, though, the Democrats' plan is working really well in terms of sitting on everybody and having no alternative. If it's head to head and you've got 5 Republicans, that actually is a pretty good place for you to be, because you can defeat those, let alone the 300 other candidates that are going to run. Lastly, on the jobs report, if those jobs reports keep going south, or there's some lag, and the lag is in middle income to higher income jobs returning, because the lower income jobs have started to already come back and will come back as restaurants and bars, for example, reopen. So
hospitality increases, vacationing, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, that's exactly what will happen. So if the numbers lag or don't hit the astronomical ideas of, say, 1 million or 900,000 like we had today, that is a problem. But it's a good problem to have for the administration, because it gives them an argument that you would need something like a conservation corps and an infrastructure bill to put people back to work. So in that sense, it gives them a pause. They have to justify why you need to pay so much this particular plan, but they have an ability to pivot. The Biden administration is ready to pivot because they know they need success. The Trump administration doubled down and didn't pivot. The Obama administration didn't think about a pivot because they thought they had it right as well. So there's a lesson to be learned here that we see out of the Biden team that we haven't seen in recent presidencies.
Yeah. Well, that wraps up our time today, but thank you, Professor McCuan. You always do an amazing job. You cover everything. You answer all the questions, and you're funny and entertaining. So we appreciate that always.
Thank you all for letting me be here and to join you with the cat, wherever she went.
Yep. Ella was the star of the show. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This was put on by the Sonoma State Alumni Association. In the chat, we have all our social media feeds. Please go like us and follow us. You can know about our future events. And if you want to help out the Alumni Association, the best way is by helping out students. And the way you can do that is with our Heart of SSU scholarship. It funds one student's entire tuition for a year. It's a really transformative scholarship. We're giving it out on a needs basis. These are some of the best scholars at Sonoma State, and they need your help, and we need your help. So we hope to see you in the future. We hope to get your support, become a member, and thanks again, Dr. McCuan.
Well,
thanks, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.